Hi, welcome to week 12. This is the book club. I'm Josh, Lacey's husband, and the reason I'm doing the book club this week is because I recommended this book, and Lacey wanted me to do it. This book is called Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, and I know what you're thinking. That looks really dorky. And I thought the same thing too. I'm not much of a Star Trek or space kind of person. I'm not into these types of books, but Samir, who's the guitar player for Flyleaf, he was reading this book on tour and he told me it was one of his favorite books, and so he gave it to me to read. And by the second chapter I was hooked. The reason I like this book so much is because it's a very psychological book. It takes place in space where they're about to fight a war, and they've already lost the war twice to these aliens called the Buggers. And so this time what they're doing is they're training up children, who they're calling little geniuses, to be the soldiers. And so that whole aspect of training up a child to be a soldier is really kind of heart-wrenching in a lot of ways, but it also opens your mind to the capability of children. I think that we don't give kids enough credit for how smart they actually are. They're problem-solving, sometimes they're just better at things than we are as adults because they don't have the same things to limit them that we do. And so I love the psychological aspect of that, and seeing the way a child processes war. I will say it's a violent book. It's actually not recommended for kids under 12, even though all the kids in the book are between 5 and 8 years old, I believe. And so it's kind of ironic in that way. I think that, when I hear my 7-year-old talk, he has some really deep thoughts and he processes things, especially at night before he's going to bed. He'll ask me deep questions about why he's alive and, like, why can't I see through someone else's eyes? Why do I only see through my own eyes? He's very philosophical, and I love that about him. So when I read this, I think of him, and again, there's parts that make me sad because of what the kids have to go through, but also too, it's, I like to think of my kids, as I'm reading this book, and I'm also just grateful for the fact that he doesn't have to be a soldier. There are a lot of countries out there where there's kid soldiers, and that's extremely heart-wrenching. So I'm going to read to you chapter 4. What I like about this book too is that there's sort of two stories happening at the same time. They're training up these kids to be soldiers, and so there's this dynamic where it's kind of like the TV show Survivor, where they're like, getting to know each other and figuring out who's your enemy, who's your ally, outwitting each other, competing against each other. And so it's a game in that way the whole time through. But also at the beginning of each chapter, it'll have the commanders, the adults, talking to each other, about what they're witnessing in the kids, or what they're thinking, the process they're thinking. And so it's cool that there's sort of, they open it up with that way, but then it switches to the kids in their perspective. So this is chapter 4, Launch. With Ender, we have to strike a delicate balance. Isolate him enough that he remains creative. Otherwise, he'll adopt the system here and we'll lose him. At the same time, we need to make sure he keeps a strong ability to lead. If he earns rank, he'll lead. It isn't that simple, Mazer. Rackham could handle this little fleet and win. By the time this war happens, there'll be too much, even for a genius. Too many little boats. He has to work smoothly with his subordinates. Oh good, he has to be a genius and nice too? No, not nice. Nice will let the Buggers have us all. So you're going to isolate him. I'll have him completely separated from the rest of the boys by the time we get to the school. I have no doubt of it. I'll be waiting for you to get here. I watched the videos of what he did to the Stilson boy. This is not a sweet kid that you're bringing up here. That's where you're mistaken. He's even sweeter than he looks. But don't worry, we'll purge him of that in a hurry. Sometimes I think you enjoy breaking these little geniuses. There is an art to it, and I'm very, very good at it. But enjoy? Well, maybe. When they put back the pieces afterward, it makes them better. You're a monster. Thanks. Does this mean I get a raise? Just a medal. The budget isn't inexhaustible. So now it switches to the beginning of the story. They say that weightlessness can cause disorientation, especially in children, whose sense of direction isn't yet secure. But Ender was disoriented before he left Earth's gravity. Before the shuttle launch even began, there were 19 other boys in his launch. They filed out of the bus into the elevator. They talked and joked and bragged and laughed. Ender kept his silence. He noticed how Graf and the other officers were watching them, analyzing. Everything we do means something, Ender realized. them laughing, me not laughing. He toyed with the idea of trying to be like the other boys, but he couldn't think of any jokes, and none of theirs seemed funny. Wherever their laughter came from, Ender couldn't find such a place in himself. He was afraid, and fear made him serious. They had dressed him in a uniform, all in a single piece. It felt funny not to have a belt cinched around his waist. He felt baggy and naked dressed like that. There were TV cameras going, perched like animals on the shoulders of crouching, prowling men. The men moved slowly, cat-like, so the camera motion would be smooth. Ender caught himself moving smoothly too. He imagined himself being on TV in an interview. The announcer asking him, "How do you feel, Mr. Wiggin?" "Actually quite well, except hungry." "Hungry?" "Oh yes, they don't let you eat for 24 hours before the launch." "How interesting, I never knew that. All of us are quite hungry, actually." And all the while during the interview, Ender and the TV guys would slink along smoothly in front of the cameraman, taking long, lithe strides. The TV guy was letting him be the spokesman for all the boys, though Ender was barely competent to speak for himself. For the first time, Ender felt like laughing. He smiled. The other boys near him were laughing at the moment too, for another reason. They think I'm smiling at their joke, thought Ender, but I'm smiling at something much funnier. So as I'm reading this, it doesn't sound like a 7-year-old kid. The things that are going on in his brain, the things he's thinking about in this interview and fantasizing about, the way that he's, this whole book is like a mind game of trying to outwit. Ultimately, they're trying to outwit the aliens that are attacking, but they're also trying to outwit each other. They leave for this like space school, and so that's where they're headed now. They're all meeting each other for the first time. But again, thinking about little kids doing something like this is really interesting. Also, too, by the end of the book, they do this flight simulation. I'm sorry, I'm going to ruin the book for you right now, but they do this training at the end of the book, and it's like this flight simulator that simulates in these spaceships, and you're fighting all these aliens, and the kids are kind of being reckless in a way because they're playing it like it's a video game. But at the end of the book, you're alluded to the fact that the whole time it wasn't a video game. They were controlling these ships they were controlling the ships, but the ships were actually manned with soldiers and people fighting this battle in real life. And so that's why it's Ender's Game, and I think games for kids, my kids are 5 and 7 right now, and they love video games. We have kind of a hard time with it, and a lot of times I want to throw the video games away because I think it's destroying their brain and their behavior. But then I see things that they're learning and figuring out that I feel like the games are sharpening in them. And so while a lot of times I'm frustrated about video games and how they affect my kids, I also do realize that it kind of builds this other fantasy, their imagination, problem solving, obviously depending on what game you have. And so I love that they call it Ender's Game. There are actually a lot of books in this series. I believe there's 5 in total, but this was the first one I read. Again, this is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card.